So, welcome everybody, and wherever you are, and for joining us from. So, as Stefan said, I'm speaking about Theresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And my initial thought that I give quite a lot of talks on each of these, but rarely do I actually speak about the two together. And it sort of struck me when thinking about this that I suppose those of us within the Carmelite family, the Carmelite milieu, would see both of these as very different, but they're spoken about in the one breath by so many people. Oh, Theresa and John, they're spoken like with any family. People, members of the family, will see two people as very different, two brothers or sisters or whatever, but people outside they go, look how alike they are, look to how they resemble each other. So there's a little bit of that in my sort of struck me as I attempt to think about, well, what am I going to say to you and how am I going to present them? What I thought I would begin by saying a little bit about how they met, and then tracing a little bit about the life of each of them in different ways, and something about their message, their teaching, bearing in mind those three words that you have: saints, scholars, spiritual masters. Sorry, is there some note? No, that's nothing to do with me, no. I saw something coming up there. So saints, scholars, spiritual masters, and how each of them fit into those particular aspects. Is obviously all two of them are saints, they're scholars, and they're spiritual masters. But those things have come about. There's a journey. There's a growing into each of those. So I begin with, and I'm going to do very little reading in this, but I'm just going to read one little piece, or maybe one other piece a little bit later. I'm going to read Theresa's account of her first meeting with John of the Cross. This is in the year 1567. Theresa is 52 years of age. She is in Medina del Campo making her second foundation. She's planning further foundations of both nuns and friars. She's searching around for the first friars to begin her foundations. She's already written 2 of her major books. She's a well-established figure, well-known. John is a 25-year-old newly ordained priest, still studying in Salamanca. He's back in Medina because that's where his mother and his brother are living, and he's there to celebrate his first Mass. And he's brought along by a friend to meet this nun who has just founded a new convent in Medina. Here's Theresa's account of their meeting. A little later, it happened that a young father came there who was studying at Salamanca. He came along with another as his companion, who told me great things about the life this father was leading. The young father's name was Fray John of the Cross. I praised the Lord. And when I spoke with this young friar, he pleased me very much. I learned from him how he wanted to go to the Carthusians. Telling him what I was attempting to do, I begged him to wait until the Lord would give us a monastery, and pointed out the great good that would be accomplished if, in his desire to improve, he were to remain in his own order, and that much greater service would be rendered to the Lord. He promised me he would remain as long as he wouldn't have to wait long. So that's Theresa's little account of the first meeting. However, we need to sort of get a little bit into the background because it's so significant. It's life-changing. It's a life-changing meeting for John of the Cross, and it is, the consequences of it are enormous. John clearly is at a moment of crisis in his life. He has joined the Carmelite order. He has just been ordained a priest. He still has one more year of studies to do in Salamanca. But he has made a decision to leave the order and to become a Carthusian. Now, I'm not going to go into any details about that, but what is just from our point of view, that conversation with Theresa is life-changing for John. He obviously confides his reasons to her, the crisis, whatever is going on in his life, and she talks to him, listens to him, and how long all of this took, we've no idea. We know nothing about the meeting beyond what Theresa tells us. But we can see that the beginning of their relationship is one where John becomes a disciple of Theresa. Theresa so influences him at that meeting that he changes the direction of his life. It is life-changing for him. So that is sort of just to kick off this. I need to now tell you a little bit about Theresa. For those who are, I'm aware that perhaps some people are very familiar with her. Other people will perhaps know very little about her. And I just want to take a very quick journey through the life story of this woman. And the times, she's a person of her times when she lives. We're in 16th century Spain, a very particular era in the history of that country, the history of that people, the golden era. And Theresa's born in 1515 into a family. She tells us that there were 3 sisters and 9 brothers. There's really 2 families, because there was her father, the previous 3, and then his wife died, and then he married Theresa's mother. When Theresa's about 14, her mother dies. She's born into what is known as a converso family. That's a family of people who had converted from Judaism to Catholicism. Her grandfather had. And there's a whole stigma around all of that and a whole complex history around it that we're not going to go into. We haven't the time to. But it is something that Theresa is very conscious of, and something that, while she never ever speaks about it in any of her writings, any of her letters ever make, it's there all the time. It's a factor that she has to deal with right throughout her life. Like all girls in her time, she didn't receive a formal education. But both her parents were readers. And Theresa, from a very young age, was a reader. She learned to read and write at a very young age. She loved reading. She was only happy when she had a new book, she said. So books, reading, writing, what would become Theresa's life, are with her from a very young age. She's a woman of words. Words are so important to her. And there's even evidence that she wrote a novel as a teenager, at least one, perhaps even more, but they haven't come down to us. but reading and writing so important for her. The only kind of education as such she gets after her older sister marries, which would be quite common in that times, she's sent to a boarding school ran by Augustinian sisters. They didn't receive much education. It was mainly preparation for marriage. But it was influential on her, particularly one of the sisters there, very influential on her choice to be and on herself. Though she decided she wasn't entering that convent, but it was the first, because she has said at times that she never really wanted to be a nun. But something changed during those years. So at the age of 21, she enters the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation, which was outside the walls of Avila, just on what would have been the outskirts of Avila at that time. So she's almost 21 years of age when she enters it, which was actually old by the standards of the time. Generally, girls married or entered convents mid-teens. That was pretty normal. By the age of 20, 21, if they hadn't married or entered a convent, be a problem there. But so she enters the monastery of the Incarnation in Avila, an enormous institution, often called the village of the Incarnate. Varying numbers of sisters, 150 to 200 you hear mentioned, plus many of these would have had servants, and there would have been a number of other girls living there. For example, Theresa's younger sister lives with Theresa there for some years before she marries. That was very common at the time, that if mother has died, if there's a sister in the convent, she would take responsibility for the younger girls until they either married themselves or entered the convent. So you could have had a vast number of people living in an institution like that. And what happened there for Theresa? What was important for her over these 20 years that she'll spend there, nearly? Theresa I'll put it like this. Theresa's great desire was to pray. If we were to say, what is Theresa fascinated by? She's fascinated by prayer. Really, from the beginning of her time in the monastery, even before that, prayer fascinates her. Not only how to pray, but much more so what prayer will do, what prayer will lead to. What is prayer really about? And over these years, there's almost like two things happening in Theresa. On the one hand, she's been taught to pray, but she's really struggling to. How does she do this? And the methods and the teaching that she was being given just did not work for her. On the other hand, she's clearly growing and changing. And so the question arises very much in the context of how spirituality was seen and understood in those times. Was this right? We must remember we're living in a time when spirituality was very much controlled. And anyone exercising a sort of a spiritual freedom was held in great suspicion. So Theresa needed to know, is her way of prayer right? And therefore she needed experts, theologians, spiritual directors to confirm this for her. And that's how gradually she begins to become a writer. She writes about her experience. What's also becomes apparent throughout this is that people are coming to Theresa for help and advice. But very early time in the convent, Theresa seems to have, well, on the one hand, she's struggling to pray. At the same time, people are coming to her for help with prayer. She's beginning to become the teacher of prayer. The seeds are being sown of what is going to grow and develop in Theresa over many years. What also happens there in that monastery is a little group used to gather in her cell to talk, to share, to pray together. A little community within a community, we might say. Some of whom are sisters, some of whom are, when I mentioned earlier, these lay girls that live in the community. And one day, the suggestion comes up, why don't we form a little community, a small community, where we could live more authentically what we're talking about, the ideals that we're discussing, the ideals that God seems to be nurturing in us. And in Theresa's account of this, she said she was just delighted to hear this. It was just what she needed to hear. And so that eventually gives rise to her making her first foundation in 1562, the monastery of San Jose in Avila. We've no time to go into all the details behind that or all the events, but Theresa founds her first community. 1562, San Jose in Avila. Her ideal, and her contrast this with what life was like at the Incarnation, was 13 sisters. She got that figure from Jesus and his 12 apostles. 12 apostles plus Jesus, 13. So that would be her ideal number. And for so many reasons, that worked. It was a very good figure. As time went on, she had to let it grow up to about 20 because of taking in new sisters and formation and the needs and all of that. But that was her ideal. A small group of sisters living together, an enclosed way of life. She puts it very well in her book, The Way of Perfection. Here, all will be friends. All will love each other. All will care for each other. What was very important to her was both the deep relationship with God and relationship with each other. Difficult when you have large numbers of people and so much activity like she had at the Incarnation. Now the concentration would be on what's really important. Simultaneously to this, Theresa's work of writing is beginning. Even prior to entering into her foundation, she's already written the first edition of the book of her life, but that edition has not come down to us. But then, 1565, 66, she writes the first of the major books that has come down to us, the book we call her life, though she never actually gave it that title. In a sense, that book, she's writing about her life, but it is the book, it's the story of her growth, her coming to life. At another level, it is the book, and this is not an exaggeration, that changed Christian spirituality forever. Now we have somebody writing about the depths of Christian spirituality, not from the point of view of theology or learning or any of the traditions that went before. Here's a woman writing from her own experience. And her own experience becomes, to use her term, the living book. The presence of Jesus Christ in her life. So this most wonderful book on the depths of Christian spirituality, written in everyday language, the language of ordinary people. Theresa has began what is her great life's work, bringing the riches of Christianity out of the convents and monasteries and the elite places, out and make it available to everybody. So this book of her life changes Christian spirituality. Immediately after it, more or less within the next year to year and a half, she will write her second major book, Camino, Way, Journey, Way of Perfection, whatever title we want to give it. Wrote 2 editions of it in a very short time, more specifically written for her sisters, but it's the book that outlines the way of life. I put it like this. I mentioned earlier that Theresa's interest is in prayer, but more specifically, her interest is in a life of prayer. What does it mean to live a life of prayer? And therefore, what Theresa writes about is life. What kind of people are we? What kind of lives do we live? That's what matters to her. She is in that book putting in writing the ideals with which she set out to found her first community. And what she's really doing is founding a new way of living human life. A new way of living human life as Christians. It is a way of life. A way of Christian life. A way of living with Jesus Christ at the center of one's life. What would it be like if a small group of people set out to live, putting Jesus Christ at the center of their lives? What kind of people would they become? How do they relate with each other? What kind of environment do they create? How do they see the world? How do they relate with others, etc.? This kind of, we get a sense of Theresa's, and what effect will this have upon the rest of the world? Because Theresa's conviction is that this will change the world. The world, she said, is in turmoil. The solution to that is not some major political choices or armies or wars or anything like all the things that were going on around her. The solution is to live the gospel. So even still, Theresa only sees it, she's one community and that's it. 2 things then intervene which change Theresa's thinking forever. 2 meetings. Notice how important relationships and meetings are for Theresa's thinking. The first one will be with a missionary who has come back from what she calls the Indies, but of course it's Latin America, but that's what she still calls it, the Indies, that's what's it called in those times. And Theresa is very aware of that world. Most of her brothers have gone there for political reasons, joining the army for the conquistadores. She's constantly in correspondence with people there. But this missionary comes, a Franciscan called Maldonado, who changes her thinking. Because he has come back to Spain specifically to fight the cause of the indigenous peoples and to stand up for them against the policies of the Spanish government and the other governments going there, who were committing great atrocities and all of this, and changed Theresa's whole thinking about what was happening there. It broadened her thinking, saw things in a very different way, and was very influential on her. Theresa is a person, though she never left Spain in her 67 years of life, her vision reached the ends of the world. She had a global vision and an ecclesial vision. Her concern for the church, for the world, way beyond her own horizons. The second meeting that will change her life is a visit by the General of the Carmelite Order in Rome. Tells the first time this has ever happened. One comes to Spain. Theresa meets with him. Two things significant happen at that meeting. One is the General recognizes that what Theresa is doing is authentically Carmelite. It's authentically according to the true spirit of the Carmelite order. For Theresa, that was so important. The second thing he does, he gives her, encourages her, gives her permission to found more monasteries of both nuns and friars. So she will become a founder not only of women, but also of men. And he tells her, to quote her own words, to found as many as she's got hairs in her head. He very strongly affirms what she is doing and gives her permissions, etc., etc. And hence, she's setting out now on this. First stop, the first place she will choose, Medina del Campo. That's when she pick up our story where she meets John of the Cross for the first time. Why would Theresa choose Medina del Campo? It tells an enormous amount about Theresa and her vision, her choice of the first place she chose. Medina today is a relatively small town. Well, large towns, wouldn't even call it a small city. In those days, it was a very important place. It was for its markets, its fairs. If you go there today, you have the Museum of Fairs there. A large central square where they had all these fairs. Traders came not only from all of Spain, but all over Europe to trade in Medina. It was famous for its fairs. It was there that John de Cross's parents met. We'll pick that up a little bit in a few minutes, say a little bit about them. She chose that because Theresa wanted the foundations of her nuns to be in the important towns and cities. She described her first foundation in San Jose as the star shining. She wanted her nuns to be in the centers of towns and cities. They would be living the life of prayer there with the rest of human life going on around them. People would come there to their church. They would have a relationship with the local people. She hoped, but she didn't succeed, that they would be dependent on alms and not be tied to a benefactor. That didn't always happen, but we needn't go into that. It's the kind of place she wanted to be. She wanted to witness to the life of prayer in the midst of people. Though the life of her nuns would be enclosed, their presence would be visible. It would be a star shining, giving light. And so the story goes on. Then Theresa begins her founding of both friars and nuns. And John of the Cross then would become the first of her friars. I want to pick up a little bit of John's story. I'm not going to go into great detail about his life because I simply haven't got the time to. Just a little bit about John. Let's say he's a young man, born in 1542 to the best of our knowledge. We actually don't know when John was born. And we've no record either of his birth or his baptism. Many reasons for that. One is before the Council of Trent, baptisms there wasn't an obligation to register baptisms. And particularly the baptisms of poor children weren't registered. There was also a fire in his hometown, the church of his hometown, some years, so records would have been lost anyway. So the first thing is John was born into poverty, unlike Theresa. Theresa was born into the merchant classes, the pretty well off. John was born into poverty. His mother was a weaver, hence she was in the markets in Medina. His father was from a merchant class, pretty wealthy background, but because he chose to marry for love, which was unacceptable in those days, married beneath him, he was rejected completely by his family. So he had to try and make his living on his wife's trade. They had 3 sons. John is the youngest of the 3. The middle son died when John was quite young. There was the brother just a little older than John, and also his father died when John was quite young. So his mother was left with an older boy and young little John, and they were very, very poor. She eventually settles in Medina del Campo, and that's where John will get whatever education he gets. So he's born into poverty. He fortunately gets educated. He gets accepted into a school for orphans, even though technically he's not an orphan. It was mainly because he is pretty bright. And it's good that I'm Stonyhurst, because the Jesuits had just founded in Medina, started a school there, and he got some of his education from the Jesuits. The other important influence on John's life when he was a teenager in Medina, because obviously he had to find work, and he got work in a hospital for sexually transmitted diseases and other socially unacceptable illnesses, let's put it like that, the most rejected of people. And John worked there, and the care of the sick. John was a nurse all his life. Caring for the sick and nursing were very important aspects of John's life. It says we can see there are 3 prevailing influences on John, what I've just said. Poverty, the importance of education, and care of the sick. John was an educator and a nurse. Right everywhere we know John lived, he's always, we see this, concern for education, caring for the sick and the poor. There's so much part of John's life. John joined the Carmelite order in Medina. We know a little about that. Studies in the University of Salamanca, is ordained a priest, still has 1 more year of studies when he meets Theresa. At the end of that year then, he joins Theresa's reform as the first of the Discalced Carmelite friars. He will play, though he will never be the leader of the Discalced friars, he will play a very important part in it. The only time that Theresa and John will actually work closely together is in 1571. Theresa's unexpectedly and very much against her wishes called back to the monastery of the Incarnation, the one that she left to make her foundations, and is made prioress there, against her wishes and against the wishes of the community. And let's not go into detail. But one of the key decisions she takes is to take John of the Cross there with her as spiritual director to the community. So for the next 3 to 4 years, they will work together. There's the only time they are together, they work together. And it is in the care of that big community that Theresa is put in charge of. And John will change the entire community. His influence and Theresa's influence will be enormous there. That is the only years that they work together. It puts a stop to Theresa's work of founding for a while, but once her 3 years are over there, she picks it up again and begins her founding. John stays there just to pick up one other aspect of John's life, which is so important to understanding him, and that is his imprisonment. Towards the end of 1577, and up from the end of November of 1577 to August of 1578, John is imprisoned. We haven't got the time to go into all the details of how that came about, why it came about. It wasn't unusual in those days. Monasteries had prisons. There were all kinds of complex reasons for it. But it is a very important experience in John's life, a life-changing one. Remember a few years ago, somebody making the point, and I think it's a very important one, that all the writings of John the Cross that we have got are the writings of an ex-prisoner. And people who've studied the writings of ex-prisoners see links to John the Cross, see common themes and common ways of seeing things. So John's period of imprisonment influenced very much both himself as a spiritual reality, because there he went through some great spiritual crisis of some. He also emerged from prison with some of his most beautiful poetry. So it was a time of spiritual crisis, spiritual growth, transformation, but also so many other aspects of his outlook. You're changed. That changed John in so many ways. Theresa and John will go through some very difficult years there with opposition to their work, to what they're about, etc. Theresa will live until 1582, October 1582, and she dies. By then she will be the writer of 4 major writings and a whole number of other writings. She will leave a wealth of literature behind, most wonderful spiritual writings. John is destined to live on for another 9 years. After John is imprisoned, he is sent down to the south of Spain, to Andalusia, partly to get him away from a lot of his enemies and for his own protection. And he will spend more than 10 years down in Andalusia, in many respects the most fruitful part of John's life. He will have many roles in the government of the order there, and it's where he will do his writing. John is a writer. First and foremost, John is a poet, an artist. John's whole mentality is that of an artist. He'll begin to write, he'll come out of prison with these poems, and he will add other poems as time goes on. But John's writings then that emerge are primarily commentaries on his poetry. John, first and foremost, wants to express the spiritual life through poetry. He tells us that the work of God in a person, what God is doing in a person, the experiences that the presence of God gives to a person, the effects of the presence of God on a person are impossible to put into words. And therefore, it is better, he prefers to speak in symbolism and imagery and art and poetry. The other advantage of that, he tells us, is that the Spirit of God works differently in different people. And so when it is a work of art or poetry, people can draw from it whatever is right for them. And likewise in his teaching, he tells us that he prefers to teach in general terms, so that every person can draw from it whatever is right and appropriate for them. So John will leave us with some of the most beautiful books of Christian spirituality ever. They're commentaries on poetry. They're linked to his poems. And his writings, this is the way he puts it himself. John doesn't set out to write on all the aspects of the spiritual life or give treatises on prayer and spirituality, etc. He said there's plenty other people have written those. Plenty of other books around the place, he said. He wants to write about what, in his view, people most need. Those parts of the spiritual journey, the spiritual life, which others don't tend to write about. In fact, somebody put it very well, I think, that John the Cross begins where other spiritual writers end. John sort of speaks about those aspects and challenges of the spiritual life that others are reluctant to write about or haven't got the experience to. John writes to help those who most need help, or help people in those aspects of the spiritual life where others don't write about or speak about, and where help is very much needed. So John, right throughout his life, had a reputation as somebody who really understood the spiritual life and that people turn to, and people of all walks of life. Okay. To pick up then, what I want to pick up now, I'm watching my time. I'll keep going for another 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions for you, because I'm covering a vast range of issues. I just want to pick up the three words that are at the basis of these talks and just say a little bit about them in relation with the two people we're speaking about. First of all, the term saint. Obviously, both of these people are now beatified, canonized saints. They're both doctors of the church. In fact, only very recently we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Theresa being made a doctor of the church, the first woman to be made a doctor of the church, 27th of September 1970. How might we understand holiness in the context of these two people? Because holiness is a word that we kind of use, but what do we mean by it? And if we were to try and define it, I think, for Theresa and for John, we could probably define it something like, here are two people who lived human life well. Their way of seeing holiness is a very down-to-earth one. It contrasts with so much of the image of holiness that was all around them. They changed how holiness was seen in their day. It was seen in their day, a sense a bit elitist, artificial, cut off from ordinary life. I mentioned when speaking about Theresa that she brought the depths of spirituality out into the streets, wrote it in the language of ordinary people. John did the same thing. If you look at the people that John ministered to right across society. Theresa speaks about God among the pots and pans. It is one of the most quoted phrases in Theresa's writings. But we sometimes forget the context of it. What Theresa means by that is, wherever the pots and pans of a person's life are, that's where God is. Wherever the everyday, the mundane, the routine, wherever that is in our lives, wherever the drudgery and pain is, wherever the sacrifice is, wherever the hard work is, that's where God is. That's the place of holiness. That's the sacred place in our lives. The sacred is not in some elite place. It is in the midst of life. For Theresa, we become holy in the midst of human life, in the midst of human relationships, in the everyday struggles of life. What we see in Theresa's life, we're to look at Theresa's life. Tell the story of her growth, spiritual growth, which we know enormous about. And we look at the life that she was living. We notice that the deeper she goes spiritually, or the more that her spiritual life develops, the busier she becomes. Or the more her spiritual life develops, the more she becomes engaged in the problems and difficulties of life. And the more she's involved in activities, projects, her communities, her writing, her founding, her relating with people. Holiness is not cutting one off from everyday life, but is about a deeper engagement with everyday life. We see the same pattern in John of the Cross. We see John writing about the very depths of Christian spirituality, but in beautiful poetry, in beautiful art, in songs that were sung for everybody. So holiness, they have their particular take on holiness. Though they may be associated with convents and monasteries and founding convents and monasteries and all of that, the kind of holiness they're speaking about is the holiness of everybody. They're scholars. Again, learning is so important for both of them. Theresa, as I say, lived in a time when it wasn't possible for a girl even to get formal education, not a mind go to a university. Something like somewhere between 10 and 15% of women could read and write, 50 to 60% of men. But even a lot of those who could read and write was very rudimentary. Few women had the capacity to read and write that Theresa had. But she prized education. She befriended all the main theologians and scripture scholars of her day. She speaks over and over again about these learned men because she wanted their learning. Why she loved the Jesuits. Jesuits were such an enormous help to her in so many ways. She prized learning. And she saw it as an essential for living the spiritual life. One of her great aims for her communities of sisters was that every sister should be able to read and write. She didn't quite succeed. In the context and culture of the time, it just wasn't possible. But it was her ideal, that they could all read and write, that they would have good libraries, that they would have good learning available to them. Because for Theresa, learning, understanding was very important for spiritual growth. We cannot really grow spiritually. We will not have a sane, down-to-earth, authentic, truthful understanding of spirituality without learning. Learning was so important for a right and a healthy spiritual life. John of the Cross was a great person. Obviously, he had a formal education, University of Salamanca, though he never held a professorship in any university. But he lived in university cities, Salamanca, Alcalá, Baeza, and Andalusia, and had a lot of association with universities, was involved in educating others in all sorts of ways. For example, when he was in Avila, I mentioned a spiritual director to the Convent of the Incarnation, which was in a very poor part of Avila, and he noticed there was no provision for the children's education. So John set up a school to educate the local children. It's just the kind of thing John would do. So he's a person of learning himself and a person who prized learning. And obviously, the third term there, they become spiritual masters. Yes, they became spiritual masters, but in a way that was quite unique for both of them, actually. I mentioned a little bit already in terms of how did Theresa become a spiritual master. She became a spiritual master. She tells us that she only wrote from experience, her own experience and the experience of others. Though she read and she consulted with all the main theologians and scripture scholars of her day, she was in contact with them. However, experience. And her experience was all this experience of her struggles in prayer. Prayer did not come easily to Theresa. Theresa became the great expert in Christian prayer, but she became that expert through the struggles that she had, the difficulties that she encountered. The books that she is writing, we could kind of sum up something like this. She's writing the books that would have helped her when she needed them, if she had them. She's writing what would have helped her and would have helped many other people who came to her for help, because she recognized that her experience and what she learned from her experience helped others. Others needed this as well. So she becomes a great spiritual master through experience, through recognizing the need that she herself had and others had. John of the Cross, like John, never set out to be a spiritual master. And he would never have considered himself to, yet he did. And he did so through that desire that he had to help other people. John became a spiritual master, I would say, because of the three things I mentioned earlier. His experience of poverty, and poverty was so widespread at the time that he lived. Spain was the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world, but the vast majority of his people were getting poorer and poorer throughout John's life. And we won't go into the reasons for that. Poverty, illness. He saw so much illness, plagues, all kinds of illness, how much people were suffering. And the lack of education, the lack of, he saw how truly impoverished the lives of the people all around him were. That's where John's stimulus to become a spiritual master came from, not from some high spiritual ideals, but from the reality of human life that he saw around him. John became convinced that human life is about more than this. He saw that even in the poorest and sickest of people, it was never enough just to give them food or care or education. Though he spent his life doing all those three things, John learned the real needs of people. The real needs of people go beyond that. And the real needs of people are artistic, intellectual, and spiritual. John cared for the whole person. He had a great regard for the whole person. He became this great student, we say, of what it really means to be a human being. Who are we? What is life about in this world? What is it really about? It cannot be such that 90% of the people live in dire poverty and ill health and destitution. That's not what God created the world for. That's not what God created us for. A God who's in a relationship with every person. So John becomes a spiritual master through encountering human life at its most painful, its most vulnerable, its most tragic. That's the journey John came from. That's where he is coming from. And that's what informs everything that John teaches.